And then let that intention rest in the back of your mind. Again, let it be the filter for everything that comes. Sorry, remind me of your names again? Ken? Yeah. Kenny and Jeanette. Kenny and Jeanette. Gotcha. So this is you're coming into the midst of a very technical, in-depth course of study, which is good. I don't mean that in a bad way. But just to say, you can kind of, everything isn't things external from us, right? And we can very quickly get that way about Dharma and teachings too. And it's like, well, I have to get it. I have to understand it. If I don't, something's wrong with me, or I failed at something else, Dharma's not meant to be like that. It comes in and, the things that are important that you need will stick, and the things that you don't need will wash off. So you can just have some trust in that, in that process, and be attentive, but not spend too much effort, right? Okay. So, just to get our bearings again. So we've been talking in this course about different schools of the original Indian Buddhism, right, as characterized by the Tibetans. Now, one thing that I should say, this again, we're in a Gaelic tradition, right? So this is Jason Kappa, right? This is the founder of the Gaelic tradition. When did he live? Who remembers?
1357.
Yeah. Yeah.
20.
Close, 1419. Good. That's impressive. So what we gotta have to realize is that when we study this stuff, we think, oh, we're studying the original Indian schools as they were thought of in India. That's not necessarily the case, right? This is a reworking, particularly from Jason Kappa, looking back in time and making the definitions of these different schools of thought clear, right? So it's just interesting in my kind of research and looking at other ways, other characterizations of this, is that different Tibetan schools have different characterizations of these different schools, right? So I think that's just helpful to know, because again, we can get really caught in like, well, this is the way it is, and this is the different system of thought. But actually, just like they say, there's many roads that lead to the same place, right? There's a lot of different understandings of this stuff, and they're suitable for different people, right? So it's kind of like, again, understanding the emptiness of the teachings, right? There's no one way. It's what's going to be suitable for the individual in terms of what they need at that time and going to help them progress. So even the things that we're talking about here is that, they're empty. They might be different depending on somebody else's context and somebody else's viewpoint. Hi, Tiffany. Hello. Long time no see. Hi. So, again, what we're learning is this is the 4 Indian schools from the Gaelic perspective, right? So just important to know we have that lens on. Okay, so what school have we mainly been covering so far in this course? Mind only. Great. What are the schools that are what we call lower than mind only? Yeah. No. Closer. Yes, you're on fire tonight. Good job.
I don't have to answer any more questions.
Oh no. It's the opposite. Now I'm going to ask you more questions because I know you can answer them. Okay, good. So now, what does that leave us with in a broad category? What school are we left with? Well, Prasangrika and another one together, which make... Yeah, middle way. Yeah, good. So you got the middle way left. So we haven't talked about middle way yet. So how many schools? Middle way is divided into 2 schools. What are those 2 schools? Yeah, good enough. Yeah, very good. Which has nothing to do with Tantra, by the way. There's a big confusion there. It's about Tantrika. They think, oh, it's not a... I thought that for a long time. I was like, well, do these guys, I mean, this is the real deal? Because they're the Tantrikas? No, there's nothing. Everybody is getting the same level of realization at a particular section of the path, no matter which track you're on. Also, I think it helps our understanding of emptiness a little bit more clearly because some of the other schools tend to, well, let's not go there. Maybe the importance of it will evolve a little bit the more we discuss about it. Okay. So let's look at this chart a little bit. So, have you guys heard of emptiness at all? Is this the first time hearing that term? Pen. Should we do the pen? Who's got a pen? Okay, we'll do a quick emptiness intro. Thank you. Oh, it doesn't have to. Okay, what is this? It's a pen. Wait, what is it? Is it a pen? Okay, I was just checking. You're sure it's a pen? Okay. So I take this, and I wave it in front of a dog, right? And then I throw it. What are they going to see it as?
Stick.
Yeah, stick, or we say chew toy. I guess that's the traditional one. Chew toy, right? Stick, same thing, right? Wait, so is it a chew toy or is it a pen? Which is it? Right, good, yeah, you got right to the chase. So that's the positive assertion of what you're saying. It's dependent on who sees it, right? That's what we call dependent origination. The negative assertion, which is the flip side, is just to say it's absent of being something independent of that perception, right? In other words, if it were a pen or a chew toy from its own side, it wouldn't matter if you saw it as a pen and the dog saw it as a chew toy. One of you would be wrong, right? But because it lacks this nature of being either a pen or a chew toy from its own side, that's its emptiness, right? If it had some quality of being a pen or a chew toy from its own side, you or the dog would have to be wrong. But because it doesn't exist like that, it's actually only interdependent with the way you're seeing it. It lacks being something inherently, right? That's its emptiness. So one way we say this is like, okay, we put the pen down, everybody leaves the room, no dogs, no humans, no aliens, whatever else, right? What is it? Right, what is it? Well, you can't, right, and that's one level. And this is coming, what you said actually points to one degree of emptiness that they talk to in the schools. Some schools say, well, it's something, we just can't label it. But the highest, what we say, the highest understanding is saying, no, when you take away the perception, right, you can't say what it is at all. Now, I'm not saying that when you turn your back and you don't look at the pen doesn't exist anymore. That's going to an extreme. What I'm just saying is you can't talk about how the pen exists, right, independent of how you're conceptualizing it, independent of how you're talking about it, right? And we can see this already has immediate implications for your reality because most of the times we feel victim to things being a certain way and we don't see our contributing outlook in making them that way. So the whole idea of emptiness is just a complicated way of saying the power is really coming from your side. You're not being bombarded by objects, right? It's the way that you're viewing things that actually makes your reality. And emptiness of objects is the quality that allows you to do that. Because again, if it did have some quality of being a pen or something else from its own side, you wouldn't be able to do that. You'd be saying pen, but it would really be a chew toy, right? So when we talk about, I'm addicted to kombucha. When we talk about varying degrees of emptiness, everybody agrees that there's something about the pen that's coming from you, but different schools, admit either more or less of how much is coming from you, right? It's varying degrees. The highest school says Other schools will say, well, there are some things about the pen that have to be part of the pen that's coming from the pen itself. They're like a stepping ladder. The more and more you go, the closer and closer you get to a full understanding of, like, there's nothing about the pen that's outside of your view, right? So this is the point of view of, okay, so let's go over this a little bit. There's certain steps you go through in order to becoming a Buddha. And there's 5 of them. Accumulation. Preparation, thank you. Preparation. Seeing, thank you. And then it's habituation. We talk about preparation as you're learning how to drive the car. You're getting acquainted with your mind, you're studying emptiness, you're thinking about these things deeply, you're seeing how it applies to your daily life, you're really getting, it's preparation. It's, you can say it's like learning. Then you have the path of seeing. How long does the path of seeing last?
30 minutes.
Yeah, 20, 30 minutes. Yeah. It's, okay, so in comparison, how long does preparation and accumulation last?
Eons.
It could be eons. Could be 5 minutes, right? But the reason the path of seeing is 20 minutes because it's this experience of seeing emptiness directly, right? So they say, we talk about in Buddhism 2 different types of cognition. You can have conceptual cognition and non-conceptual cognition, which is seeing something directly. So conceptual cognition is like, even when I recognize this as a table, it's conceptual. Because I have to look at it first, and then I have an imprint of what the object is, and then I have to compare it to all these other things I have in my mind and match it up, and somehow I have this category that I say, oh, table, and I put it on the object, right? You can think of conceptual cognition having to do with categories, right? There's nothing in this thing in and of itself that will suggest to me table. I have to compare it to categories I have in my mind. So with emptiness, right? Before the path of seeing, you're basically seeing emptiness through this kind of category, right? The problem, and this is very interesting, that the problem in seeing emptiness directly and seeing it conceptually is that you think emptiness exists self-existently. I'll just throw that out there, right? The problem with seeing emptiness conceptually is you think emptiness is a self-existent thing, right? That's for the Dharma heads. So non-conceptual. So this idea of seeing emptiness directly is you see it non-conceptually. You just see it directly. I don't know what that's like. I haven't been there yet. Right? But the idea is that you're not going through this mental process of, I guess you could say in a very loose sense, of reasoning in order to see it. It's just apparent to you, right? Have you guys ever seen The Giver? Or read the book The Giver? It's a kid's book, and I remember this one scene. They're making a movie out of it now with Jeff Bridges. Apparently, it'll be good. But they don't tell you in this whole. He talks about. I think this is a great analogy. He's in this world, and he looks at an apple one day, and one day he just says, he just says the apple changed, and he couldn't understand. It was different. He looked at it, and it was different, and he had no way to describe the difference, right? And he's talking about this. So basically the idea is that he's in this dystopian future, and the world has changed, and there's this guy who's the giver who holds like all the knowledge of the culture that the people don't have access to, because it's kind of like a Garden of Eden thing. It's like if they had access to knowledge, they'd fight again with each other, and they'd be wars. So this one guy called the giver has all the knowledge in the world, and the rest of the people don't. So he goes to this giver, and he asks him, why? What am I seeing? Like, I see this thing change, but I don't even know how to describe it. He says, oh, you're seeing color, right? Because everybody else was actually seeing in gray tone and black and white. And he had seen a red apple for the first time. And I think that's a beautiful way to describe it, because imagine if you didn't have a category for color. Like, you didn't know what that was. A kind of classic example is like, how does a fish in the ocean realizes that they're in water, right? It's the same type of thing. So it's like, you see color for the first time, it's going to be this very visceral experience, but you're like, how do you describe that? All you could say is something like he said, like, it just changed, right? And I imagine this is what the direct perception of emptiness is like. It's a feeling of that thing I thought was there the whole time is not, mainly a self-existent object, right? but you're just like, whoa, it's not there. And then somebody says, well, how is it not there? You're like, I don't know, it's different. And, like, how would you, it's that kind of ineffable space where you wouldn't, you can use it you can describe it in all the language we're saying, but the actual experience of it, I think we can see, would be very different than how we talk about it, yeah? So that's the path of seeing. And then on top of that, we have the path of habituation, which just basically means you've seen emptiness now, you stay in that state all the time, you just got to get used to that, right? And eventually you get so used to it, you get to the path of no more learning, and you become a Buddha, right? So here's the thing. Prasangika, there is only 5 paths, right? So Tantrika, they have 3 different views. They say that each level of realization really involves a different level of emptiness, right? So they have 3 different degrees of emptiness, and then they have 5 paths along each of those different degrees. So how many steps do they have in total? 15, right? So this is a very different view. This is why we don't, we talk about, mostly when we talk about, we just talk about the five paths, because we're not dealing with different levels of emptiness. But in Svatantrika, we're saying, no, there's 15. And then it gets even more complicated because you don't necessarily need to go through those linearly. There's actually, you can start here and then jump to another one, and then, sometimes regress on the track. So they say for whatever reason, I don't know how they do the math, but there's 20 permutations. There's 20 different ways you can go. Yeah?
Just a quick question. We normally don't study Svantantrika at all.
Mm-hmm.
This is kind of like the first time that I've ever heard like these subtle differences.
Mm-hmm.
Why is that we're now just learning this? And is there more that's going to come later that we're going to learn about?
Well, I think for one, the way Geshe Michael, he put this class last, right? And I think part of it is that you need to have, it's kind of like throughout the other courses you've built up your understanding of emptiness, but then we all have residual things that are kind of not really a correct understanding of emptiness, but do belong to other schools. So the reason that we learn the other schools is to articulate those views that we think are emptiness, but in fact are not the full understanding. So Svatantrika, for example, I know for me, for example, I always thought of dependent origination as something appears a certain way and then you throw a label on it. Like first it comes up and then you label it as something.
That's how you use it.
That's how I used to view what dependent origination was. But then when we got into this stuff, I realized, oh, wait a minute, that's a Svatantrika view. In Prasangika, you can't talk about the basis like we were talking about last class as nauseum. You can't talk about a basis and then a label. They co-arise. So I can just say from my own experience, it helps tease out. When you realize that these kind of, I don't want to say incorrect, but incorrect views are really belonging to different schools, it helps you refine your understanding of emptiness. Does that make sense? Yeah? Questions? You have that look. Okay. Okay, cool. So they have 15 paths, and then you get 20 permutations. I like Prasangika just simplifies it. It's just 5. Just do 5. So let's look at this chart. So these 3 degrees of emptiness correspond to what I have in the grade part, the tracks, right? So the listener are self-made Buddhas and Bodhisattvas. Have you guys heard the term self-made Buddha before? Yeah? Self-made Buddhas are interesting. One, because they're not self-made, nor are they Buddhas. It's a complete contradiction. Self-made means that in this lifetime they didn't have a teacher. But if we look in interdependence, dependent origination, they must have learned it from somewhere. So they say that they've had teachers in past lives. This life, it's kind of like they've become very introspective, right? And they just kind of, through self-analysis and deep critical meditation, I guess you say, they come to a certain level of realization, right? It's interesting because I've always thought of a great example of self-made Buddha is Eckhart Tolle. Have you ever read of Eckhart Tolle's work? Eckhart Tolle was he talks about, he was like on the verge of suicide and, mentally afflicted and, just didn't want to live anymore. And he said one day he just woke up and it was gone. He woke up and he just is like something lifted. He just had that experience. And he's been writing about his realizations ever since. Now, again, we say this is the whole idea of self-made. Did that just happen randomly? No, it must have come from causes, right? And this is why we say in Buddhism there must have been causes from a previous life. Because how else do you go from completely depressed to all of a sudden this sudden, spontaneous awakening? But the idea is that because they study what's called, so here's a question. Each of these also study different subject matter. So what the self-made Buddhas really focus on are the 12 links, which are the 12 links of dependent origination. This is how karma flowers, right? This is how when, because of your ignorance, right? Because of your ignorance, you come to, in 12 steps, this is how your ignorance causes suffering. It's like from alpha to omega. From ignorance to suffering, it happens in 12 steps. And what self-made Buddhas do, they basically, through meditation, my understanding, this could be incorrect, they almost retrace those steps. They can introspect and look back through those 12 steps and see how it leads to, see how it comes from ignorance. And once they realize that, they're free from suffering, right? So, the listeners, on the other hand, right? Self-made Buddhas, on the other hand, when they get to their path of seeing, they realize the lack of self to gross objects. Not gross like yucky. I realize there's no such thing as gross objects. And then the next one is subtle object, right? Lack of subtle object. So let's go into what these mean. So these actually correspond nicely, or pretty exactly, with the 6 flavors that we went over last time. So let's go for gross self first. The gross self. Actually, this is not, and it's funny, this is why it's the 3 degrees, because gross self is not included in the 3, because no Buddhist school believes in a gross self, right? What does a gross self mean? A gross self is the idea that there's some unchanging part of you that makes you you. Like what we normally think of as like a soul, right? And is it Greek? In Greek philosophy, they had a term for this, deus ex machina, right? The ghost in the machine. They had this problem of like, well, what animates you? Like, what makes you do stuff? And they would say, well, there's this ghost in the machine. There's some animated spirit that's monolithic and unchanging and makes things happen, right? Also in Hinduism, the same idea, Atman, right? It's like your supreme, unchanging core to your being, right? The thing that's essentially you and never wavers, but yet animates all of you, right? And I think it's not that this is what, we all think about when we think of my soul, right? Like you think the soul you have when you're 3 is the same soul that you have when you're 30, right? And it hasn't changed. It's your pure unchanged. It's like this little gemstone in you or something, right? Yeah. This is what we think about as the soul. So it makes sense actually because the Buddha's big departure from Hinduism with this idea of anatman, right? There is no such thing. There is no unchanging core to the person, right? So the gross self is not even part of the 3 degrees of emptiness because that lack is not even, that's outside of, that's what it just means to be Buddhist at all, right? So then the subtle self. This is interesting. I struggle with this, how it's different from the first for a while, but this is the idea that, okay, we might accept that I'm a changing thing. Like there's no unchanging core to me. There's no some precious gemstone that doesn't waver, this is how we talk about ourselves, right? Like Jed goes through changes, Jed lost an arm, Jed gained 20 pounds, Jed, whatever. Like Jed possesses the things that change about him, but Jed himself never changes, right? The subtle self is saying, well, okay, I admit Jed changes. Me as a person changes. We go through change. I recognize on some level that, the Jed of 3 is not the same as the Jed of now, right? And there's nothing fundamental unchanging about me through that time. But we still think, well, there's something, Lammermoor calls it almost the Captain Kirk. There's something that owns these parts of me. In Buddhism, they call it the 5 aggregates, but we can just say body and mind to make it simple, right? You think you have a body and a mind. You don't think you are your body and mind. I mean, why? Look how we talk about it every day. Like, I hurt my knee, you know, or I'm feeling anger, you know what I mean? Or you don't say I'm anger. You don't say, you know, ow me, right? You say my knee. So it's like this idea that even though you admit that you're changing, you think that there's some entity over and above the parts that you possess. I mean, just this level, and this is the grossest, this is really deep, y'all, because experientially, that's not how I experience my life, you know. I think I have all these things, but there's some I who owns them, right? I don't think I'm my mind, you know. I think I can have thoughts, but I think there's some me that are not those thoughts, and I'm just having them, right? You know, you don't think your body because, and sometimes we go back and forth. You say, my body's sick, I'm sick. Yeah, but we all recognize that we feel like there's something distinct from our body. If you really didn't think that you weren't distinct from your body, if you had to get an operation to get your appendix taken out, you would say, no, you're going to kill me, right? You'd be like, if you take out my appendix, that's me. Obviously, you don't think that. Now, even with the brain, I mean, for a while, people say, yeah, well, people wouldn't want to, you know, I know in neuroscience now they kind of identify more with the brain. And they say, well, the brain is the seat of your identity because nobody wants a brain transplant. Well, you can take out half your brain now. I've read studies where people like this amazing violinist, they took out half his brain. And the other, you know, you have your 2 hemispheres. And you know, the idea was like, well, if you take out half the brain, you're going to lose all the ability associated with this hemisphere. And they found that actually the remaining hemisphere actually bifurcated and started to behave in the 2 different functions that the 2 halves previously had before. So it's like, you know,
Same capacity?
I don't know if it was same capacity. But, I mean, he could still, I think the story, and this is me really trying to remember back, but he still was able to play the violin, you know. He was still able to perform. So, why was I going down that? Basically, the point is, you can't find, you can't find a thing that is you in your parts. Just a simple way for us to say it. You can't identify with one part of you and say, that's me, right? You're a grouping of your parts, but that doesn't mean that there's some you independent of those parts. This gets very subtle. We all recognize that we're not one of our parts, right? But yet somehow we think that means, okay, there are my parts, and then there's the real me, who owns all those things, right? But to understand that you are the grouping of the parts and yet you're not one of those parts individually, that's a mind fuck. I mean, and I can tell you, I've had small experiences of this where you can witness the flow of your thoughts, for example, and have this feeling of, oh, I am not having these thoughts. I exist as a grouping of these thoughts, but there's not some me out here that's like the producer of these thoughts that's just making that all happen. Right? And it sounds just conceptual, but I will tell you that this is the source of grasping. When you suffer about things in your life, it all has to do with around you making, because you think that there's something solid, your own mind and body. It actually covers all form. But they're going to say, okay, true, this thing that you're calling self is just a grouping of these 5 aggregates that has no independent reality from those aggregates. But they're going to say, but the objects in and of themselves, the parts that you're made of, right, those exist whole and complete, right? So like, deal with outside form, for example. And it's not constricted to this. Really, it's having to do with your own. But they say, for example, it's a bottle out there, this is a complete object. And it's independent of you, right? And for example, you do have an arm, you do have a leg, you do have a face, you do have a body. You you wrap those things all together and call it you, but those things exist. The things you're wrapping together are real and substantial. Does that make sense? Right? From this point, from the lower school. So now when you get up to the self-made Buddhas, they talk about what's called the gross lack of object. And this is what we've been talking about in mind only, right? The gross lack of objects is that you think that the object that you're looking at, your part, and this is the idea that the perceiver and the object are coming from the same karmic seed. So everything happens for a reason. Well, was that controvertible that something happens for a reason? That doesn't really make me feel better about anything. But what it's really pointing to is that you don't encounter other schools that you can say, okay, I recognize that I'm made of these parts, but then when you have a cancerous part, and the lower schools will say, well, there's a different way that you can view it. You got cancer. I mean, this is how we believe it, right? You had too much fish with mercury. Now you've got cancer, right? I don't think that's scientifically how it works, but like this idea of the pen, right? There's no pen coming from its own side at all. Whatever you're experiencing as the pen is coming from you, right? This is what we mean in prasangika, that it comes from the same karmic seed. So then again, the gross lack of self-nature to object is this idea that things are not coming by accident. Those are still within the realm of your perception, right? There's a reason when something happens to you, meaning that it's something that's in your control. Not in that moment. It's not like you can just see it differently and poof, it'll change. But as soon as you say it's coming from something that you did in the past, then all of a sudden you're empowered to change it, right? In the future. Come for you, but there's a pen out there, right? And the subtle lack of self-nature to objects, even in the moment into existence and older. And you can slowly open your eyes. So that's just a quick look. It's the idea that you're concentrating on this one part, right? But what's happening to the other parts of your bodies when you're not cognizant of that, right? So it proves, for example, you think that you experience your body as a totality, right? And with the pen, you think that you see the pen in its entirety all at once, but in fact you don't, because what your mind is doing very quickly is you're looking at the top, the bottom, all these parts, and then from that collection of information, actually over time, you put onto that pen. But what's all really out there is parts. Now, so from their point of view, is there has to be parts out here that gives you some indication of pen. However, these same parts could indicate something else to you. Not necessarily pen. Could it suggest time machine? That's a stretch. Maybe. But again, you can see how this is a step from the other school. And in the gross lack of self-nature to objects, you're seeing the whole object at once. And you're saying, okay, this came from causes. This object, which I think is independent of me, is actually coming from causes that I put into play. But in the moment, you're seeing something in totality that's separate from you, existing definitively. Granted, there's certain qualities that you can attribute to it that they say are coming from your mind, right? This next school, the subtle lack of self-nature to objects, again, it makes the what you think is out there a little bit more amorphous, right? Now there's not a whole object out there that you're throwing qualities onto, right? It's not even like a blank screen that you're throwing things onto. It's actually just like pinpoints of information that you have categories in your mind to throw something on that. Does that make sense? But again, this is not the full This is not the full picture. We'll get to the full picture after break. Have any questions? No? Okay, so let's do a little quick summary of this by analogy. So, in Svatantrika, they talk about this as the magician analogy. Do you know the magician analogy? So, yeah, the horse. Yeah. So, in India, this apparently happens. I've never witnessed it, so I can't say. But in India, there's these magicians, and they do these magic tricks, right? And the way it works is they have to have something to be like the basis of the illusion, right? They can't just conjure up an illusion out of thin air. They need to presto change something into something else, right? So a magician goes out here and he throws a stick onto the ground. And then he does some magic words, and all of a sudden it appears as a horse, right? Actually, let me refine this a little bit, just for the sake of the analogy. So the magician has a stick behind his back, let's say. And he says, I'm going to have a horse appear out of nowhere. And he says some magic words onto the stick, and then poof, the horse comes out, right? So this is the way that Svatantrika describe emptiness and dependent origination. And we'll get into how. So the magician is like a person who's seen emptiness directly. They know that the horse is really a stick. But they've been put under the illusion. So they see the horse, but they know it's really a stick. The crowd of people watching who just see the horse, they're like normal, everyday you and I. Or maybe just me. Right? And they don't know that the horse is really a stick. They're convinced by the illusion. Right? The last one they say is the latecomers. The people who weren't there, the magician has to say some secret words or else the illusion doesn't work. So the magician, they weren't there for the secret words. So when they come there, they just see a stick. Two things to say in this. One, the Arya is like the magician because he's seen emptiness directly. He knows it's a stick, right? Normal Joe Schmo. And then the Buddha is the one who doesn't even see the horse at all. They don't see the illusion. They just see the stick. So that's describing different levels of realization. But why this? So they're saying first the stick, then the horse. And this is how deceptive reality works. Your mind takes all that, throws it together, and says, pen, after the fact. Right? Makes sense? So what you're essentially describing is a process of ego. You have to talk about there being definitive characteristics before you see the horse. Well, it's not irrelevant to the other. Stick is irrelevant to a horse. That's why it might be an analogy. But Okay. I know. Okay. What is it like to see emptiness? And this is the analogy of how Prasangika describes emptiness in the view of things, right? So Svatantrika's talk about this example. So just so you know where this comes from, because I was always curious. This is from Kendra Tempa Darge, who wrote the monastic textbooks at Saramay that Geshe Michael studied at. He's commenting on Chandrakirti. This example first comes from, and Chandrakirti is talking about Arya Nagarjuna, and Arya Nagarjuna is commenting on the Buddha, right? So there's a lineage for this example. It's not just like some made-up thing, yeah? So I always want to know, where does this stuff come from? So maybe you're like me. So here's the thing. So you have a glass of wet and flowing. Why do we call it wet and flowing? Well, because it's not water until. So again, just to get this behind this idea is that what defines a really small throat and esophagus, right? So they're constantly hungry and they can only eat a little bit of food, right? This is really interesting too, because I think what we were talking about last class is like, well, is that literal or is that figurative? It's like when you see that all language is metaphor and symbolism, right? And this is the highest view of emptiness. Everything that is literal. We're going back early in the course, remember too, where we said the only thing that's literal in Prasangika point of view is direct, right? Or we can get our mind around how it's possible. Yeah. So anyway, that's technically a Buddha. Let's just say that they really like stuff, right? They see it as pus and blood, right? Or pure ambrosia, right? So what's the explanation? Explain it when Khedrup Tempe Darge explains it. He says, there's not one thing out here relative to each being's karma. So let's look at it this way. Well, it gets tricky. Wet and flowing, and then one being throws karma into pus and blood, another one throws, hit 3 different parts to the wet and flowing, right? So this gets into to have a similar base. This is why there's 3. Looking at Angela, right? What am I seeing? Literally, I'm seeing eyes, nose, mouth, rest of her front, right? What is Tiffany seeing? She's seeing profile. She's not seeing 2 eyes. Man, they seem really down. And Kelly's all like, no, she seemed great. She seemed happy. Everything was fine, right? Depressed. Oh, sorry, being happy, right? And again, not understanding this is the source. The reason that we have uniform consensus on something is because it's that way out there, right? And there might be discrepancies in the instrument, but we nullify that through what this is pointing to. But that's what reality is. This is what a shared reality, truth, is. Other worlds I have no access to, and people tell me that elephants are flying in outer space, and I guess for them it's because they say, well, it's all from my point of view. So it's somewhere in the middle. There is a shared reality. If we could really get, this is what wars are started over, for real. It's what the resolutions of these kind of things are, but the whole idea of the middle way is the way that we get closer. That's a, you could say eternalistic or nihilistic, depending on how you look at it. If you go to the extreme of facts, but the more and more, I really believe the more and more you can get in touch. Take this idea, well, everybody has their own karma. How can I give anybody advice on extremes? Yeah. Either feeling disempowered with people because you feel completely independent of them, or feeling like what's best for everybody. And also I'll say, again, this idea, you have a connection. One way to say it is that people live in their own worlds, but you have a connection to that world. So I think really what this inspires you to do is just listen. Like in Buddhist debate, they talk a lot about, there's this another dividing thing which we won't get into between Sautrantika and Prasangikas, the nature of logical arguments. And so Tantrika, because they believe that there are definitive things out there, they talk about what's called autonomous logical syllogisms. They think that you can prove things definitively about the world independent of your viewpoint. Because there's something about the way that things function out there, definitively. Prasangika, on the other hand, says there's no such, you can't, they use another, I won't say they dismiss, but they use another logical form where they say you have to argue from the point, you have to understand what their worldview is and what they accept as true. You can't just start with truths. You can only talk about truths relative to the other person and build it up from their truths to get it to a conclusion, right?
What about like math though? Like 2 plus 2 is 4.
If you're in a base 10 system.
Okay, well,
What if we had 6 fingers and we didn't have 10? 2 plus 2 wouldn't be 4 anymore. So we'd probably be working with base 6. There's no self-existent truth.
it's not going to be independent of your karma, obviously, but if everyone's karma is the same for that one thing, 2 plus 2 is 4.
Sure, exactly. For inherently? No. It's relative to the karma of that group. Interesting, like they talk about all these, there's this big thing in well, like unified field, I don't know, to particles, to, electrons have a certain spin, or, are the way they are, matter is able to coalesce and come into form in mass, right? Like if it was a little bit different, it's kind of like, think of it, this is that allows it to coalesce and form mass. It just happens to have those properties, right? That could create another possible foundation to reality. And who knows what that would look like. Right? Right?
That's only for this round,
Huh?
right?
These musicians? And like,
Musicians.
yeah, these like musicians. Apparently there's musician gods. He played music for them.
So it's like art.
In that context. Right? He was a pleasure being. He was at the end of his, he had the classic signs, and he said, his garlands were withering, his breath smelled bad, all his friends rejected him, and he knew he was going to be, he saw his best burst, he was going to be a pig, then like a snake, and then something, and then he was going to go right to hell, right? And then so he went to the king of the gods, and the king of the gods was like, I can't do anything for you. Well, maybe the Buddha can. So he got the Buddha, and then Buddha emanated, I think, as white Tara, and taught him the Nam Gyalmo mantra. And he said, do this 6 times a day or something, or do the practice for 6 days, a rebirth into a pure land, and became a Buddha, and like whatever. And that's a big deal, because from a Buddhist point of view, when you've spent all your good karma, it's like he had nothing left. Like, put it in perspective, get a human birth, it's like, one, right? And then only doing this practice for 6 days, he accumulated enough karma to go beyond a human rebirth and go to a pure land. All these teaching like, well, those in the God realm, they enjoy life too much, so they don't have no inspiration.
What if you're, became a god and then you drop back down and you need to work your way up, but you required like...
That's the insidious thing about the God realm.
Over lifetimes work your way back up.
No, you can. That's what's samsara. The problem is without suffering is you have no way to accumulate merit. So you just spend it all and then you drop. You can't. I mean, again, there's stories of it in the God realm, but you have no motivation to.
If you don't see suffering in your realm, right? Everyone else is also blissed out with you.
Yeah.
In that realm.
Yeah.
So you can't really practice.
Yeah. But to say, because again, this goes back to the whole thing. Are they literal? Yes. Are they also symbolic of something? Yes. Make a little bit more imminent sense rather than this kind of abstract thing about, again, I'll say with your beliefs, it has to do with your practice and working with the material, right? So
All right.
it is water. But the idea is, so when you're talking about water, right, the water reduces to its parts and the karma. Then you say, well, what about and the parts is this time is a part of the wet and flowing. So now you're asking about what about the wet and flowing? Okay, wet and flowing, its parts and contributing factor of karma. But you're never going to find the ultimate part in the ultimate projection. It's always going to divide, no matter what level you're at, to parts and projection.
So then why do they say wet and flowing? Well, there's one thing that
Yeah.
if the God sees it, it actually is immovable. It is actually that.
The reason the wet and flowing is important is because it's to point, my understanding is to point this idea that there is a shared reality among the three beings. And what is that? It's that they have, it's just like seeing the different parts of you, right? It's like there's a consensus there that there is a wet and flowing out there among the three beings. One way you could talk about it's like when they analyze it further down. Like, this is why you could say that emptiness is the ultimate truth for all beings, because when you analyze anything down, it's always going to go into emptiness, right? But you can say that they have these discrepancies, but when they analyze down a few levels, they do come to a consensus on wet and flowing,
Yeah.
right?
I get that for the teaching purpose, but I still feel like it's like, I mean, I know it's water and I know it's pus and blood for the hungry ghost, but it's like, it's kind of pointless to say it's wet and flowing if it's still going to be an imputation on.
Well, no, because, but it applies, like, it happens in our reality all the time. Like, for example, if I say Angela is upset and Kelly says Angela's happy, right? If you don't have that understanding of the wet and flowing, you're going to think, oh, well, the Angela I'm talking about is completely independent of the Angela that Kelly's talking about. And that would be a misunderstanding. Like, in our conventional reality, we get that we're talking about the same person from different points of view. And without the understanding of the wet and flowing, you have no idea, you have no ability to make sense of that with emptiness. See what I'm saying? You have to explain how there's a common locus to objects. That's the technical term.
And wet and flowing is a quality. It's not the actual object that you're putting anything on. It's only a quality that's similar.
But saying that it's wet is, I don't know, that's just what I...
In this context, it is the object, though. It's the wet and flowing. It's not just the liquid is wet and flowing. It's a translation of the Tibetan. It's like you'd say liquid. Liquid is sometimes a better word. It's a liquid.
Wet becomes like...
Yeah.
But that still makes it harder, I think, when you say it that way, to not think that you're just throwing something like to yourself.
Yeah, it does. There's a nuance there, because if you take it one way, you're going to say, oh, there's a liquid out there, and we're seeing it three different ways. But when they go through the analysis, it's, this is why there's different parts to the liquids, right? This is why they talk about the different parts of the liquid, because there's a liquid that's being imputed on three different parts, which are the basis for each being's karma, right? But that's imputed. There is no substantial thing that is the liquid that is throwing itself to all beings and that they're seeing differently. This is that's why the parts of the liquid are important. Each being has their own part of the liquid. And then those parts, from our outside point of view, we're imputing liquid.
So pus and blood is a part of that water.
Huh?
Pus and blood is a part of that water.
Pus and
I mean,
not part of this water. Not part of the, first, part of the liquid. You can't say part of the water.
Oh, okay, part of the liquid.
Right. But you wouldn't say pus and blood. You're saying a part. The pus and blood is
That's just an example. So it could be what?
the pus and blood is the result of a part of the liquid and the being's karma to see pus and blood. But again, you can't reduce it to one or the other.
Yeah.
Basis and projection. Basis and projection.
Are you saying it's everything? All at the same time then? It could be everything?
Yeah, because it's not just three parts because of everybody.
Oh yeah, I know. There's not just three parts necessarily.
That's just for the teaching.
How many parts are there to Angela? It'd be dependent on how many people are in this room. But on all those parts, could we still say conventionally that those are the parts of Angela? Sure, it's a convention.
It's weird to think there's not an amount of parts independent of how many people are viewing it.
I know, yeah.
Because
But then you're going to self-existent parts. Yeah.
I think it's confusing to call them parts because usually when we say parts, we think parts make up a whole. Take away part, there's no longer a whole.
I think, yeah. I mean, I think there is a whole put on parts in the sense of what is the common locus that we're all perceiving. And the three beings, there's a common locus that's being imputed on something, right? What is the shared reality that they're all partaking in? And that's imputed on the three different parts which make the basis of imputation. Now, you're right that if you removed one of the parts, it's not like the liquid would go away, but in a sense it would, because it's a liquid that's a consensus among other beings now, because you've taken one being out of the equation.
I think it's limitation of language, but with studying this material,
Mm-hmm.
to save part. The reason we're so limited is because we're thinking of liquid as self-existent liquid.
Right.
So when I say part, I think of a part there, but I still think that because just saying part, it's an obstacle.
Yeah,
Even when
I hear
say
you.
it now, I have to go through a mental exercise to make it make sense.
And it's suggesting that it's there's a self-existent thing there.
Mm-mm.
Yeah,
How?
that's how I'm seeing it. It's like the way that we're talking
Because
about
if there's parts of the liquid, it can't be a self-existent thing. See, if I said that there's a liquid that three people are seeing differently, then sure. But that's not what we're saying, right? They're saying there's three different parts.
But I still think of it as there's something there, and I'm throwing something on it. That's how this conversation just turned for me. That it is more that there's something that's there that's whole that can be viewed in different ways.
We see that, okay, so I think with that's a confusion of thinking that the parts of the liquid refer to something out there, aside. This is the gross lack of self of emptiness. There's no liquid there above and beyond the parts that are the basis for each being.
It co-arises.
That's true too. There's two things, you could say there's two things that are happening. Each being is they're having their experience of the liquid, right? They have a part of the liquid in their karma, a part of the liquid in their karma, a part of the liquid in their karma. So for each individual being, there's a basis and then what their karma is projecting onto, co-arising, right? On the outside, if we're trying to look at what are all these beings seeing similarly, we can impute liquid on the parts that they're all projecting onto. So it's just,
That's what's similar between all three of them?
yeah, it's another way of saying, it's another way.
Another being could see nothing. Could see a
True.
dry cup.
Sure. They just wouldn't be partaking, because then we wouldn't be able to impute the basis of their perception. We wouldn't be able to call that a part of the liquid. That's all that means. It just, their basis of perception wouldn't be a part of the liquid. It would just be something else.
So they don't part of the liquid.
No, but they might see a part of the glass if they're seeing an empty glass.
So they don't matter.
For this conversation, no.
No, they're not getting any of that thing. It's sad.
If it's pus and blood, you don't want it. I think it's helpful to just think of it that way, that there's not, the liquid is also imputed. The liquid is also an imputed thing. And that's why the parts of the liquid become important. Right?
It's just hard to think of everyone, like, okay, if you think of 4 people in a room, everyone's perspective, because if it's changing, if so happened 3 people were in that room, and then, they made up the whole thing, it just is hard to think of, like, each person is pertinent to that cup of water. Their aspect, if that makes that up, right?
Yes,
Because
and
then one person could be taken out and no big deal, then it's just 3 people in the cup of water.
yeah,
And then that makes it up.
yeah.
So there's 3 different cups of water there.
It's the same cup because it's part, right?
There's
If 3 humans
wait, do you see? There's 1 cup of water. There's 1 cup of water. Why? Because they all have. True, but that doesn't mean that. They conventionally it depends on convention. So saying that they're separate is just as much self-existent as saying that it's multiple perspectives on the same thing. You're trying to figure out what is your question, is it actually separate or is it actually the same?
No, I'm kind of like a karma crazed person. I think that everything's my karma, right? So
basis of imputation and favoring karma, and that's one that's impossible, right? You can't have a projection, right? It's not all just your karma. You can't tease these things out. It's always basis in karma.
So the plant has its own karma? It has its
No.
own.
Well, no. Karma involves a way of seeing the world. This plant has no way of seeing the world. It doesn't have karma.
So that's only from her.
What's only from her karma?
Seeing it.
No, there's also a basis of imputation, which is the seed that was put in the soil and the water and the light and all those good things. Now, all those things are interdependent with your karma too. However, you can't say that it's just my karma, nor can you say it's just the plant. It's true that I think it's all interdependent with your karma. That's very different than saying it all is your karma. It's creating your experience of the world, how you know things, how you interact with things, right? Okay. Right. So this is the idea of how it's different. Is that if you were saying that your karma created this,